Hello, my bookish friends out there in booktube land. I do hope that life is strewing your pathway with rose petals and candy. What I thought we'd do in this video is take a look at 5 excellent reasons why you should read the classics. So, go and get yourself a coffee and put on your thinking caps, because we're going to be tossing in some rather sizable marbles of thought to churn around in the old noggin. So, 5 brilliant reasons why we should read the classics. The reason I brought this video up is because a lot of people, when they hear classic literature, they think of people, with long noses orating. They picture these great dusty tomes kept in some cellar in a university, full of archaic language and dense verbiage, which only people with a 2-metre circumference head can understand. Well, piffle, balderdash. It's not true at all. I'll give you an example off the bat. The Count of Monte Cristo, if you've never read it, is a classic. It weighs in at almost 1,000 pages, and you know what? It breezes by like it's only 100 pages. It is action-packed from beginning to end. It is amazing. It's certainly not this dense tome of scholastic learning. The classics are actually very exciting to read and to take into the soul, as it were. Another reason I wanted to cover it is the disturbing trend in education circles of wanting to get rid of teaching children and youths the classics, and instead vying for, well, why don't we just teach them something they're interested in, like Harry Potter? Well, I'm not disparaging anyone's work. However, if one cannot tell the difference between Harry Potter and the classics and why one is better for a young mind to read on, then one wonders how a person who recommends such a thing can keep a straight face when saying that they have been educated in literature. So our first reason for looking at the classics is because the classics force a person to stretch themselves. I don't know if you've ever heard this expression, but thinking is the hardest work a person can do, which is why so few people do it. It sounds rather condescending, but do you know there is a huge amount of truth in that? People spend a lot of time working on their physical well-being, and quite rightly so. In fact, I could do with doing it myself. But the mental effort to stretch one's own perceptive powers, to stretch one's own world view, to be able to take into account the pros and cons of different contesting points of view, to be able to challenge one's own biases by presenting the best argument from the other side, is one of the jeweled studs of life's golden crown. It truly expands a person. Reading the classics will give you a much wider roadmap to finding things that work. Because I'll take, for example, Dostoevsky, who I've recently read. He was a student. He wanted to change the world. Many an author wanted to change and shape the world. But lots of their literature shows how many of their grand ideas came crashing down, why they didn't work, or what, in retrospect, could have been done differently. Or if only they'd had this experience, then it would have altered the way they'd gone about things. You see, that's one thing you will get in literature. It stretches your experience. You are able, in 500 pages, sometimes less, to take in maybe 10 years of experience of someone's life who is able to put it across in a way that can be comprehended. Now, how valuable is that? And that's the classics, because the classics, they really do endeavour to stretch your perspective. Another thing that makes you stretch with the classics is the way things are described. I'll give you an example of that. The Hunchback of Notre Dame. Fabulous book, but when you start it, it has this rather long-winded opening of describing Paris. And it's easy when you're reading to be like, yeah, get on with it. I've seen this at the beginning of the Disney film where they zoom over all the rooftops of Paris. Now, you see, we have that benefit with film that things can be painted for us and we can get within seconds what it took an author 3 days to write. So why should we be interested in reading it? Well, back then people wanted to explore the world, but they couldn't travel and they didn't have the photographs and they didn't have films. And so they relied on an author being able to conjure up a grand description like a movie scene for them to explore the world, to see Verona and Venice, to go to the Brandenburg Gate, to fly above the rooftops of Paris, to run around the back alleys of London, to venture forth on the waves to a new world. When we take the time to read the classics and we imbibe those words and we begin to stretch ourselves, force ourselves to work in mind to create the image in our head, you begin to pick up a vocabulary and a way of thinking and a way of perceiving which is far more sophisticated than you are used to having. And then in life, that means you will be able to look and appreciate more things around you. Your perception and ability to explain and connect with the world and dream of it and memorize it and to touch it becomes much better than if you have not read these things, because it's training the mind. And remember, if you watched any of my other videos, words, which we have in descriptions, are the colour with which we paint our own worlds. A second reason for reading the classics is actually a really good one when you get the sense of this. Classic works overall work on a hypothesis. We often think of hypotheses being something only in science. But a hypothesis, what is it? It is an idea you've got and you're going to test to see if it's true. So what about, here's a thought, better it is to have loved and lost than to have never have loved at all. Is that true? How do you know it's true? Very difficult to scientifically prove it. But what the classics do, an author may take this idea and they will examine it under the microscope of a story. They will get a character to engage with never having loved at all, and another character who maybe does love, maybe loves multiple times and suffers heartache many times. Or maybe it's a character who has never ever loved in their past and has turned their nose up at it, but then they finally fall in love, but it's taken from them. Now, you can explore that phrase. And for anyone out there, if you want to take that and make it into a novel, go ahead, but credit me when you're famous. A lot of modern books, and a lot of those who say that we shouldn't bother teaching the classics, but should teach Harry Potter or something of that ilk, I think they've got the wrong idea that all literature is merely telling a yarn, a story, something to pass the time. Certainly not what the classics are. Even the modern classics, they step beyond a story and are plumbing something much deeper. Now, for instance, I've got here Tess of the D'Urbervilles. Now, I have done an in-depth review, I think it's like 40 minutes long, of just the hypothesis in this book, and I really advise you to watch it. Obviously, I'm going to say that because I made the video, but genuinely, because it shows what you can dig out of a book, what the classics hold for the reader. Now, people know the story of Tess of the D'Urbervilles. It's Tess, she's from a low family, and then things go horribly wrong when she's, taken advantage of by some horrible bloke, and she has to run away because society is terrible towards women, and she meets someone else, and he doesn't treat her very nicely, even though it starts off well, and so on and so forth. That's the story, and it's easy. A lot of people will say, well, what the story is about is the unfairness of society, particularly against women. And you know what? Hardy was definitely a feminist, and he was very aware of the difficulties that women faced. But to say that that was what the book was about is to really miss a lot of the book. Hardy doesn't just want to say, oh, times are unfair. He's got an idea. And in this book, there's a phrase he uses where he takes one sentence of a Robert Browning poem and he twists it. The sentence is, God is in his heaven and all is well with the world. Hardy, halfway through the book, quotes that poem but says God is not in his heaven and all is wrong with the world. And it sort of leaps off the page at you and you begin to think, oh, here is an idea that Hardy is examining through the story of Tess. Yes, other social things come into play. The levels of society, the unbalance between the haves and the have-nots, a woman trying to exist in a man's world where all things are defined in men's terms. All these things are true, but the hypothesis beneath is much, much deeper and touches everybody. Practically all classic works follow a hypothesis. And it's sad that for many people, they'll have never heard of this idea whatsoever before, because I certainly didn't hear it in school, but by talking with those who are very versed in the classics. So that's our second reason. Classic books, unlike much modern literature or much pop culture literature, they explore an hypothesis rather than just tell a story. The third reason for reading the classics is an excellent one. In fact, it's quite an exciting one. It's one that makes you want to go and tackle a classic. Classic works do not leave you indifferent. You can love a classic work and you know, even if you forget the story in 20 years' time, it will have still put a tint or a hue on the way you perceive things. You'll remember the feeling a classic work gave you, even if you can't remember all the details. But it will never leave you indifferent. Now, what do we mean by that? Well, we mentioned a hypothesis earlier. That one we use, better it is to have loved and lost than to have never have loved at all. Say a book was written about that, and what happens in the story, you can sense the author's opinion is they agree with that statement. You might not agree, and often you'll disagree strongly, but at least you will understand where the author is coming from. And this helps us to develop sort of a 360-degree view of life, rather than just two eyes looking forward at our immediate needs, wants and thoughts and biases. We are able to draw in a mass of conflicting data and weigh it and make an informed decision on the way we travel our steps through life. Great Expectations by Charles Dickens. Great Expectations, a lot of people say they do not like the protagonist, Pip. Now, why don't they like the protagonist, Pip? Because others find Pip one of the best characters in Dickens' works. And how do you react to Miss Havisham? A lot of people think she's great, but others don't. How do you react to the way the story ends? How do you react to the way Pip perceives London? How do you react to the way Pip compares one person to another? I would say it's almost impossible when you get to the end of this book to be indifferent towards it. You will either be moved by it, you will either be left contemplative, or you'll detest Pip. And that's another reason to read the classics, because if they don't leave you indifferent, they have shaped you in some way. And that is an art. It means that you have learned the perspective of an author and their experience which you never else would have had. Now that's valuable. Remember, in those 300 to 1,000 pages, you may have taken in the essence of 15 years of a very thoughtful person's life. That was number 3. The classics will never leave you indifferent. Number 4. Reading classic works develop a world construct. They can create an entire cosmos in the mind, a point of reference for our everyday life. Now, of course, a lot of the classics are much older than our time period, and this is the reason some say they shouldn't be taught at school or they're irrelevant now because they were hundreds of years ago. Again, what a narrow-sighted view. Technology has changed. Certain social structures have changed. Economic systems have changed. But people's emotions and desires and ambitions and sorrows and joys have not changed. They remain true. That's why a classic stands the test of time, because it is a universal theme. It doesn't matter what the person's wearing or what mode of transport they use. They still feel as vital to us today as our own mother and father do. And what the classics particularly are good at is they build a cosmos of characters who are reflections and shadows in our own life. When you read the classic characters, remember it's not just a story. The author has taken the character to put them in a very real situation and to see what can happen, often based on their own experiences or their own deep observations, or sometimes, if you've ever done writing of your own, you will know that a character can literally take on a mind of its own. I believe it was in The French Lieutenant's Woman. Smack in the middle of the book, the author jumps out and tells the reader that I'm sorry about this, but my characters have all taken on a life of their own and they're not doing what I intended them to do. And the classics are good at this. They will get characters to move about and react to different scenes. Now, if you've got a cosmos of these characters in your mind, when you travel through life, you will find yourself coming up against a situation which may be a surprise. And on reflection, you might think, this reminds me of, let's say, Gabriel Oak from Far From the Madding Crowd. Or this reminds me of Edmond Dantes in Count of Monte Cristo. It actually can give us big arrows pointing in directions we could take, which we could never have by just our own experience alone. The classics often explore things of ethics and morality and society. Now, we can have our own views of that, but how expansive can our view of those things be in just our own short lifetime? One thing that confuses me in the world is safe spaces, to be put into a place where you don't have to listen to or be challenged by something that offends you or troubles you. Now, I'm not advocating that people should go around just being ruthless. However, to hide away from other arguments and another way of perceiving things. Wow, I mean, talk about giving a limited view. If you take the example of A Tale of Two Cities by Charles Dickens and compare it to many people who want to transform society revolutionarily, Dickens was aware of the fallout of the French Revolution. Dickens was totally sympathetic to the reasons for the revolution in France, but it wasn't called a terror for no reason. And when you read that book of A Tale of Two Cities and you come up against Madame Defarge, you totally know where she's coming from, but you would hope you were Monsieur Defarge, who is far more balanced on what he wants from the revolution. And Dickens shows this propensity for ideas of revolution, of drastic or traumatic change. He shows that they're not as straightforward as they are theoretically on paper, and that lives are involved. Now you see, that is what classic literature will give you, this ability to see the future of your own thoughts, because nothing under the sun has changed. People have done many of the things we want to do today before. Another example of the world constructs being made by this cosmos of characters is how much we can get in touch with ourselves and our own sense of being. All of us think of ourselves as good people, generally. However, have you ever read Richard III by Shakespeare? Now, Richard III is one of the baddest, most wicked villains in all of literature, and he's amazing. He's magnetic. And you can't help but half root for him through the whole play. You're sort of on his side, even though you know he's a baddie. In the opening scene of Richard III, Richard talks to the audience, and he basically says that there's this peace come in the land in the middle of the Wars of the Roses, and he's really ticked off about it. And because he's deformed, he's not made to be a lover. He says something very interesting. He says, because I am not made to be a lover to entertain these fair well-spoken days, I am determined to be a villain and hate the idle pleasures of these days. You're told that at the beginning of the play. This man hates the pleasures of the days because he can't enjoy them, and so he'd rather have war and wreak havoc on other people so that he can get the crown. You can't really sympathise with the character, and yet there's something in that play that puts this character in the cosmos of your mind, and you recognise yourself in it. How many people are free from ambition totally? How many of us can say that in every situation we always take the saintly view, that I'm in a situation that I don't like, but I'll try to get along with what everyone else is doing? Or do we privately feel I am determined to be a villain? In other words, work against the situation. Now, that character becomes, he's so brilliantly written that character of Richard III can be stuck in the mind. But when you meditate and think about and get affected by his sort of ghostly visitation towards the end of the play, just before the Battle of Bosworth, is there a moral warning towards all of us? You see, the classics grasp at what it is to be a human being and teach us how to be. The fifth reason for reading the classics is because it develops a sympathetic mind. I think we've already mentioned, haven't we, this 360-degree view of the world is much better than the narrow degrees of just our eyes looking forward, based on just our own experiences. Reading the classics will give you the attitudes, perspectives, the angle of coming in at something, people of all different backgrounds and different societies and different levels of society. You know, you've got Dickens, who worked, blacking shoes when he was a child. You've got Disraeli, who became a prime minister. They've got a totally different upbringing. So imagine gaining those insights from those people. Another word for a sympathetic mind is a cultured mind. A sympathetic mind can put the feelings and attitudes of another person into their own heart. They can share the experiences of another group of people. That is so valuable. Again, one thing that makes a classic is when it comes to conflicting ideas. A great novelist, which is essential for being a classic, will propose the best argument against their own position. I'll say that again. They will propose the best argument against their own position. It's so easy when we've got an idea and we want to prove a point to set up as the opposition a really rubbish argument that we can just knock down with a single stone and say, you see, my way of thinking is right. And that's a childish way of thinking, isn't it? Classics allow us to find the strongest reasoning and arguments against our own position and force us to weigh our own bias up. And by doing that, we become a rounded individual. Cultured is the word. It sounds very snobbish, but cultured in the proper sense. And one of the things that a good reading of the classics will do is it slows down one's reaction, which means we make more balanced and thought out decisions before rashly acting. We can pull upon the cosmos of characters, their reflections and shadows from the past, and apply them to our own situation with a wisdom that we could never have learned just from our own experience. So the classics are there for a reason. They were not made to be classics. They have become classics because they so succinctly touch on the sweet spot of the endeavours, the hatreds, the loves, the jealousies, the envies, the greeds, the malevolence, the benevolence of humankind, and they teach us lessons. Through the classics, you can gain the experience of centuries in the space of 5 to 10 years. Now, does that sound something worthwhile to you? I'm going to add a little appendix on the end of this video To truly benefit from the classics, read them, think about them, but then take the time to dig into them. And that's one of the reasons, my bookish friends, that I've tried to make this channel, is so you can dive deeper into books. Not just a basic review, but a real getting in the wine vat and stamping the juice out with your feet kind of thing. And so, if you're looking to read some classics, by all means check out my videos and choose to read one of them and then watch the video afterwards, or even watch it before. Now, it may have spoilers in, but sometimes it's okay to go into a book knowing what happens because you're looking to draw out the message for yourself and to weigh it up for yourself. And it's not wrong to disagree with another person's opinion. But if you've truly learned something, you will know how to disagree with it in a rational and kindly way. So, I hope this video has been enthralling for you, because these points have changed my ability to look at literature. If you like classics and you love classical literature and you want to learn more about it, including Shakespeare, then hit the subscribe button and dingling the bell, and that way you'll never miss another episode of Tristan and the Classics.